Morning, everyone. My name is Deeg. I am an associate professor of urban planning at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. Today's presentation is entitled Surrealist Games and Exotic Names. We're going to take you on a journey through several student projects at the beginning design level and show you how we used some of the surrealist games to generate some interesting drawing and modeling exercises. We hope you enjoy today's presentation. Good morning. As I mentioned, this presentation is entitled Surrealist Games and Exotic Names. Myself and my co-authors are honored to share this presentation with you virtually, and we look forward to seeing everyone at a future conference in the coming years. As some of you have been to our campus or may know about us, we are located just outside of Indianapolis on a suburban campus of 22,000 students with programs in architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, urban design, historic preservation, construction management, interior design. And we share duties across three disciplines: architecture, urban planning, and landscape architecture in our foundational first-year program. So myself and my co-authors represent three disciplines in that common first-year curriculum. Many of our thinking and our learning exercises are patterned off of a few of our pedagogical models, from Bloom's Verbs to Gropius's Bauhaus curriculum, to our early first-year curriculum authored by Arthur Shaler. And we've been building on some different learning and teaching theory, including Bruner's spiral curriculum, this idea of immersing, structuring, applying, immersing, structuring, applying, a series of exercises that students then build upon throughout the course of a semester or throughout the course of a year. The idea of immersing, introducing, and then structuring, applying different knowledge or different skills across a series of projects that really sought us to begin to connect some of our projects in our first year program. We built them around the narrative of Invisible Cities and some of the stories and descriptions that are contained within the book Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. These very exotic descriptions of different portions of Venice, or these imaginary places that really start to stimulate education in our students' minds. We then were inspired by some of the surrealist games and how those have been informing lots of design thinking exercises from IDEO and other folks who are specializing in design thinking, and how these different games that the surrealists did could inform design thinking and inform design education. And we're inspired too by Ken Robinson. I was very fortunate to hear Ken Robinson speak in Anaheim, California a few years ago, the late Ken Robinson. At the heart that the collaboration and creativity is something that doesn't happen in isolation, and that studio-based education and project-based education is very rich, in that it has these opportunities for diversity, these opportunities for collaboration, these opportunities for students to learn from one another. And so one of the surrealist games that we picked up on rather early was the exquisite corpse, the idea that we could put students together in groups and start to, with very basic media, begin to create some layered drawings with a piece of cardstock. If we were to group the students together around each invisible city that they were assigned or had chosen, that they would start to draw descriptions of that invisible city, whether it be in plan view or diagram or section or perspective, and then pass that piece of cardstock to one another, and that these drawings would just simply start to collage together, or start to layer together to become these very rich expressions of that particular city. And because they were all grouped together around the same city, they could learn from one another's interpretations of what they were gleaning from the literature itself in terms of how these cities are described by Calvino. And then a simple piece of cardstock, while very somewhat not precious, we then would even carve into that and fold it and start to make something three-dimensional out of it. And we, being the inventive educators that we are, those could even become parts of the landscape. And so a drawing is not precious, but it becomes something very quick and dirty, and something which can become a two-dimensional, three-dimensional expression very quickly. Another, building on that, another exercise that the Surrealists gave us, this idea of the collage and how it respects or responds to things, images that are already made, and then start to build up those into a collaged atmosphere. We concentrated on Ching's primary elements, which are circle, triangle, and square, and how we could collage together layers of these cutout pieces into figure ground, figure field interpretations, inspired perhaps by the Noli plan for Rome, and how that figure ground becomes an expression of a city in plan form. And so that these 9 squares with cutouts of black paper, white paper in circles, triangles, and squares could then become figure ground interpretations of the invisible cities that the students were assigned. So this starts to really get them thinking in plan view and thinking at an urban planning or urban design scale, and how one moves through these cities using only the primary elements to express that difference between mass and void. After that, these expressions of the figure ground then could become interpreted again into plan, section, and perspective. So this is another different exercise from a different time, but one in which students really did start to interpret their assigned invisible city from Calvino's text and try to imagine it as a real place, and starting to imagine what it would be like to live there, going from the figure ground and into plan, section, elevation, and perspective. And so these expressions are from a situation where we were not socially distanced, but in which students had a little bit more time to examine the city plan, the figure ground, and then start to extract sections and perspectives from it in order to interpret the landscape of their chosen invisible city. And in some cases, those cities were underground or had very difficult conditions in which their citizens were dealing with. Then we take one tile for the elevation and an assemblage of the 9 tiles in plan, and start to extrude or extract expressions of solid and void from it. And in my case, I use the free version of SketchUp to share with the students as a way of starting to examine that extrusion. And so the figure ground becomes an expression of solid or void, and then students have to literally then begin to interpret extruding volumes up and extruding volumes forward. And the architecture for us is really where the collision happens, and how you then start to carve and move about these different planes and solids that can be extruded from the plan view and from one tile acting as the elevation for a imaginary pavilion or architectural expression. Always looking for other opportunities to collaborate. Another surrealist game in the form of Word Spinner allowed us to extract verbs from the text that the students were working with, and then use those verbs to modify a classmate's form. So this required the students to go back into the literature, pull out the verbs, and in some cases this was a challenge for students. Students were found it to be sometimes an interesting exercise to look for all of the verbs that were in this short passage, and then figure out how a verb could become an architectural operation, and then apply it to a classmate's project. So we have study models happening here. We can see one tile acting as the elevation and the 9 tiles acting as plan, pulling out a verb from the text and then using that to modify it somehow, using some very simple tools, whether it include ripping and tearing or scissors or realignment or otherwise. So a hackathon was held in the spirit of Word Spinner, the Surrealist game, and you pull out a verb from the chosen text and you use that verb to modify the study models to take it in a different direction. So students are literally learning from each other in terms of how these different verbs can be formed into different operations. This is just a couple of weeks before the great exodus in which the pandemic forced us to go to virtual learning. Reactions from the students were interesting. Sometimes it was a little awkward at first, and I did give them time limits, and so it was sometimes a little stressful, but the new ideas that were extruded from this exercise really do allow the students to enjoy each other's interpretations and ideas, and how they can quickly react and think on their feet and find ways of thinking about architectural space in new ways. And the students do help each other and support each other in a lot of different ways. A few days later, final models were completed based on those suggestions and based on those new ideas, and so we have these three-dimensional expressions of the invisible cities based on interpretations from figure ground, figure field, modified through some of the verbs that were taken from the text. And then we review them together and start to imagine them as a city block. I do assign some scale to it. You can see a few scale figures inhabiting the models, and so students are introduced to the concept and idea of scale very early on. We then go back to drawing, and we ask the students to do all 6 elevation views of that particular figure to understand and learn the orthographic conventions, as well as understand and use the concept of line weights to create illusions of depth. So the 6 orthographic views from all 6 sides then become a drawing composition. Then we jump over to another Surrealist game, the Surrealist game of Frottage, the idea of rubbing different textures to layer a composition together, to take some of the architectural ideas that they've explored in model form and now go back into drawing and start to examine the concept of section and starting to apply some of these architectural ideas onto a site. And those texture rubbings are interesting because they get students into the building, they get students into nature, and they start to find out what these different textures can how they can be brought in to express different forms, different materials, and different surfaces in drawing form, both in elevation and in section in this example. Unfortunately, right in the middle of this was the official exodus from campus, in which our campus did shut down due to the complications of the pandemic, and students had to relocate to their homes within approximately a 2-week period. And so this is, as many of you remember, it would be mid to late March of 2020, in which we completely flipped our studio and project-based learning into an online learning modality. Undaunted, we challenged students to start looking into their communities using online mapping and observation as they were allowed, to perhaps think about a small project that could be that could support social distancing in their communities. So building on diagramming, sketching, observation, and online mapping. Students were able to select a number or a small selection of sites that were close to them. And again, as they were allowed to and as they were able to explore nature and outdoor spaces, obviously we were dealing with a situation in which folks were able to walk and to experience the outdoors. We were able to guide students to their community GIS online viewers and start to get some site and topographic information, or sometimes climate information, begin to use diagramming disciplines in order to achieve a rudimentary site analysis of a chosen site in their community, and then propose a small placemaking project based on some of the ideas, ordering systems, patterns, grids, and others, things that they had explored in their previous projects. And so that with only a few weeks left at this point, and with an online modality, there were a lot of different challenges that students were dealing with. But as this quote from Casey Afani from a podcast, everyday improvisation is about being cognizant of those small moments when you're dealing with something unplanned or unscripted. And certainly COVID-19 gave us those moments of unplanned or unscripted situations in which students had to reinvent the way that they were doing their college education from home. Concept Board was a assistant to many of these efforts, turning in two-dimensional work, scanning two-dimensional work and marking it up in Concept Board using the online markup tools, as well as students able to comment on each other's work, make suggestions and observations for improvement, and being able to collaborate in Concept Board in real time, facilitated either by a Zoom call or even an audio call, depending on how their technology needs and abilities were extended. Certainly, bandwidth and access to technology were issues that some students did struggle with in their lockdown situations. So I have a table here in the paper that explains how some of the things we were used to on campus had to be modified and whether or not that was mobile device friendly. While students' cell phones are certainly a form of distraction while they're on campus constantly, it became, for some of them, the link to the online mode of delivery, as bandwidth or online or computers may have been limited in their households, given that many of their families were working from home or they had siblings that were involved in their own online modalities. So we had to really think about how projects could be modified around school supplies and office supplies that are available in their homes, and how they could interact and deliver and scan and photograph any products that they did with their mobile phones. And so we learned a lot about the different apps and modalities and how we could leverage the mobile phone to help them do that. And so back to the Bruner spiral curriculum, this idea of knitting it together and allowing one project to lead from one another became very necessary because many of the things that they learned in their previous projects on campus then could lead into a final project that was based in their community. And so that value of interdisciplinary collaboration that they learned on campus extended into online modality and previous projects informing the final project to allow them to have a successful end to the spring semester of 2020. And as the late Sir Kevin Robinson did argue, you encourage students to experiment, to innovate, not give them all the answers, but give them the tools they need to find out what the answers might be to explore those new avenues. And certainly the situation that we were presented with in the spring of 2020 with COVID-19, empowering and supporting the students to experiment, to innovate was absolutely necessary to get us through the coming months. Thank you very much.